All right, everyone, welcome to the Rational Independent. This is Nathan Lindorf, and today we are diving back into guns. And I know this is a sensitive, charged topic that everyone is pissed off about one way or the other. But this is the top topic, so this is what we're talking about. We are going to, truly unbiased reporting, NPR.org. So this reporting is regarding a poll taken on the anniversary of the Uvalde mass shooting, discussing American opinions on guns, gun control, gun legislation, and all that other stuff. And so the reporting more or less goes through and breaks down the poll. We have some thoughts, but let's dig into the meat of it, and then we'll dig into some of the thoughts that we have. Headline, poll, most Americans say curbing gun violence is more important than gun rights. Right away, like we talk about when it comes to headlining, framing is very important. And the framing of the headline is particularly important because a lot of people just take the headline and move on. So let's look at this headline. Poll. That means we're discussing people's opinions. In other words, it's not fact, it's opinion. Most Americans, there's a difference between majority and plurality. Most Americans would apply a majority. Say curbing gun violence is more important than gun rights. This is an interesting bit of framing because this framing implies that these two goals are antithetical, that you curb gun violence by curbing gun rights. This framing is particularly interesting because it implies that these two goals are antithetical, that in order to achieve low gun violence, you need to reduce gun rights. That you as a consumer or as a citizen have to choose either to have your own rights with a high crime, high violence world, or get rid of your rights that will magically result in a world where there is no gun violence. That's the dichotomy being presented. There's a lot of people who would argue that's a false dichotomy, that these two don't correlate in the way that the headline writer wants you to believe. The highest percentage of Americans in a decade say they think it's more important to curb gun violence than protect gun rights, which means they responded to a question by the pollster related to that topic. One of the interesting things that is involved in reporting on polls is that much in the way you might find in a game of telephone. First, you have someone who's politically motivated that has a question that they want answered, or rather an answer that they want found. So they commission a pollster to ask that question. They pay someone who's an expert in developing a representative sample. Representative sampling is part of statistical science. It has to do with the way you craft respondents to a poll such that their responses align with the responses of the population as a whole. It's obviously cost prohibitive to ask everybody who's likely to vote in an election what they're going to vote. But if you ask a statistically representative sample, you can ask a much smaller sample and get a result that is in line with the larger population. There's a lot of nerdy science, math weirdness, but there's pretty strong evidence that statistically representative populations are an effective measure, an effective stand-in for the larger population body when constructed correctly. One of the challenges you might find as a simple way of describing challenges with statistically representative samples is if you're asking a question about the upcoming election and you oversample Republican or Democrat. So in the general election for governor of the state of California, you want to ask ahead of time the population, who are you likely to vote for? Which candidate, Republican or Democrat? And you might find that respondents to the poll favor the Democrat, 60% to 40%. 60% favor the Democrat, 40% don't favor the Democrat, okay? But the population of the voters in California might be 80% Democrat, 20% Republican, just as an example. In your sample, you only had 50% Democrat, 30% Republican, and 20% unaffiliated. If your sample over or undersamples their political party, then your sample is not representative of the population as a whole. So you can get misleading results from your poll by skewing the sample to oversample various populations, various attributes of the population. That's one example of either a mistake or a trick employed by pollsters to get poll results that are not necessarily reflective of reality. It's also worth it to say that even if they accurately reflect their population, at the end of the day, polls are just opinion. That is as much or as little as they ever can be. They are opinion. Because they are opinion, they cannot shift facts. So for instance, let's have an opinion poll about climate science. Okay, people can be really freaked out about climate change, but it doesn't affect the underlying science of what's actually happening in the climate. Just as an example of how there's a limitation to polls, they go to opinion, and that's the end. The findings come a year after the mass shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, the second deadliest in American history. Well, they brought up Uvalde, so we should talk a little bit about it. In Uvalde, Texas, here's what happened. The school failed to secure the perimeter. They allowed the shooter to come in through an entrance that was not monitored or manned. They enforced a gun-free zone, so no one in the school carried a weapon, creating a soft target. They locked everyone down so that everyone was a stationary target. Then, in other words, all the shooter had to do was move through the school and shoot helpless civilians, including children and teachers. The police quickly formed a cordon around the school and would not allow anyone to go in. Armed police officers, armed parents, none of them were allowed to go in for nearly an hour. Finally, they went in, confronted the shooter, and the shooter died. There's a lot of damage that can be caused in an hour. Those are the facts of the case. But the media got what it wanted, a public tragedy where many, many children were killed. And they got to blame guns about it, ignoring many of the other factors that made it much worse than it could have possibly been. We're going to leave Uvalde to the side for the remainder of this piece. Interestingly enough, the report indicates fewer Americans say that they feel their community's schools are safe from gun violence, and while a significant majority feel the answer to mass shootings is strict gun laws, the percentage believing that the solution is more people needing to carry guns has jumped 10 points in the last 4 years. So we are seeing a shift in public opinion, just maybe not the one that the powers that be want to see. They give a pretty detailed graphic breakdown regarding some of the specific answers to questions, and I thought it was worth it to expound on one of these because all too often, if you get a particular poll result that's favorable to your perspective, then the media narrative grabs that little factoid, that little piece. It's another nail they can use, and they just hammer away at it. So you'll hear it over and over and over and over and over again. You'll see this in climate change when they say something like 93% of scientists agree with climate change. However, the little talking point doesn't always accurately reflect what the poll says, and the poll itself can be influenced by the way the question is structured, by the sampling, whether or not it's truly representative, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of the climate change, that famous stat, effectively what the question asked was, do you feel that human activity has any impact on changes in the climate? And if you answered yes to that question, that yes got turned into 93% of scientists agree that climate change is a thing. So I want to go through a couple of these specific questions because I think it's revelatory. First, the question is multiple choice. Which one of the following do you think would have the most impact on reducing gun violence in the US? That this question is phrased in the context of generalized gun violence in the United States. It's a very broad question. It's not a question about school shootings or even mass shootings. It's generic gun violence in the US, something to consider. One of the stats that they point out is a ban on the sale of semi-automatic assault guns such as the AK-47 or the AR-15. Now, 44% of Democrats believe that that would have the most impact on gun violence in America. 13% of Republicans agree with that and say that that would have the most impact. Here's the problem, and this is the challenge of relying on opinion polling. They're asking which you think will have the most impact, but they don't ask why. The why is very important. I'm one of those who says that this would not have the most impact to reduce gun violence. But the why of my question is important. The why of my question is because if you look at the statistical analysis of deaths in America from violence, fists and feet kill more people than rifles of all types. Not just scary black assault rifles, hunting rifles. Rifles of all type kill fewer people than fists and feet. That's a statistical reality. And to me, that's why the clear answer to this question is that banning the sale of semi-automatic assault guns, such as AK-47 and AR-15, would not have the most impact on reducing gun violence because they are not the cause of the vast majority of gun violence in America. They are not the weapon of choice. Statistically speaking, when you look at the broad question of gun violence in the US, that's how the pollster phrased the question. It's ludicrous to think that a tool that is responsible for less than 1,000 deaths on a typical year, anything related to that tool, could have the most impact on gun violence in America. It goes further than that. Here's another reason why that's not a valid answer. Purchase restrictions do very little to constrain gun violence because people who commit gun violence fall into three broad categories. Self-inflicted gun violence, in which case you're talking about suicide, which is a tragedy, but it is not the same thing as a Uvalde mass shooting. And these stats are being presented in the context of a mass school shooting. Suicide is not terribly applicable to this poll results. The second category is law-abiding citizens, police officers, etc., who use gun violence to defend themselves or others. The men who were in uniform, who confronted the mass school shooter at Uvalde and shot and killed them, or the one at the, Covenant School a few months back. These police officers committed gun violence, but it was justified. That happens. That's a portion of the statistic. Restricting them from owning firearms, from owning these rifles, is not going to dramatically impact gun violence in America because these people who fall in this category are not the primary drivers. Statistically speaking, they are a vast minority of the gun deaths, both police officers as well as private citizens. The third bucket, the third group of people causing gun violence in America are criminals. Whether it's gangs or individual criminals or any variation thereon, most people who cause gun violence in America against another person, again, setting suicide to the side, most people who commit gun violence against someone else are doing so in furtherance of a crime or multiple crimes. If I'm holding up a liquor store, if I'm robbing a bank, if I am stealing someone's car, carjacking, if I'm a human trafficker, criminals don't follow the law. So making it illegal to purchase a gun will have no effect on people who don't follow the law. This is a basic failure of logic. Sales restrictions only affect people who follow the law. The people who follow the law are not the primary drivers of gun violence in America. So it makes no sense to try and ban the sale of certain types of tools in an effort to reduce gun violence. That's not how this works. It's not how any of this works. But the poll doesn't get into any of that. It says yes or no, and the respondent doesn't have a chance to offer any kind of nuance as to why, which means that they may end up getting their answer put into a bucket of the pollster's design. 17% of respondents said that mental health screening for all gun buyers could have an impact on gun violence. Interestingly enough, more Republicans agreed with this than did Democrats. This is a measure that has more support on the right than does on the left. No one loved this answer, but more Republicans liked it than Democrats. Allow teachers to carry guns in the classroom. There's two of these answers left that we need to talk about in detail, and then we're going to set this to the side. This is one of them. There's an important principle when it comes to gun-free zones, and it's simply this. If you want to have a gun-free zone, then you have to be willing to enforce that zone with violence. In order to keep an airport as a gun-free zone, you need armed federal agents in essentially enforcing that zone. You cannot have one of the arguments about teachers carrying guns or metal detectors or armed security guards and officers is people will say, you can't have our children in a school that feels like a prison. If you want the school to be a gun-free zone, you have to enforce the boundary with people willing to do violence. Then you can have a gun-free zone inside. The alternative, probably let's call it a compromise solution, would be to say not a gun-free zone. As a compromise, to say still a gun-free zone without specific permissions or specific exceptions, such as allowing teachers to carry, allowing faculty or even staff to carry, and even better, concealed carry. That way, someone who might be considering it a target doesn't know if the secretary can shoot back, doesn't know if the janitor has access to a rifle. That sort of deterrence causes crazy people who are willing to pursue a mass shooting to pick a different target. You cannot escape the correlation that most mass shootings happen in gun-free zones. Therefore, gun-free zones, being the preferred target of mass shooters, need to be reevaluated as a policy. They have a role in the increased rise of mass shootings. The last one that I want to cover before we close is background checks for gun purchases at gun shows or other private sales. This is a nuanced thing that drives me batty because it sounds good and it feels good to the average uninformed person, but the reality is atrocious. Let's break it down. Right now, in the law, it is federally required that anyone who sells guns for a living get a federal firearms license. An FFL dealer is required in order to complete any kind of commercial transaction with a gun. If I want to buy a gun over the internet, they have to ship it to an FFL. And then I go to that gun dealer, that licensed gun dealer, and I fill out paperwork and I have a background check conducted against me, and then he hands the gun over to me and he collects a fee for that transaction so that to compensate him for his time. That's how gun transactions work right now. That is, we already have universal background checks, already the law. So why do people clamor for universal background checks? Because there is a loophole, sometimes referred to as the gun show loophole. And here's what that loophole is in reality. The loophole for gun shows, the loophole for private sales is this. If I go to the store and I want to buy a Christmas present for my father and I buy a shotgun, I'm going to go through a background check because I'm buying a gun from a federally licensed dealer. And then I own this weapon. And then I can give it as a Christmas gift to my father. Another example might be an heirloom. Hey, your grandfather was a Marine in the Pacific Theater, and this is the .45 caliber pistol that he carried when he was a serving member. He's since passed. You were very close. He wanted you to have it. Here you go. It's an inheritance. Fully functional, high-powered pistol can cause a lot of damage. It's a dangerous weapon. No federal registry, no record of that transfer or transaction occurs anywhere in the law, and that's totally legal. Now let's take the silly example of me buying my father a shotgun for Christmas. There is in the law already that if I know he is a prohibited possessor, let's say I know my dad is a convicted felon and he doesn't have the ability to legally own a gun. If I buy a shotgun and I give it to him, I've committed a crime. That's what the law currently has on the books. If I know someone is not allowed to possess a gun and I give or sell it to them, especially after recently purchasing myself, I've committed what's called a straw purchase. And I have committed a crime and I can go to federal prison. That's already the law. There's no loophole there. Here's why there's a big distinction between the gun show loophole, and reality. If you want to close this loophole, if you want to mandate background checks for private sales and transfers, the only practical way to implement universal background checks for private sales is the implementation of a nationalized gun registry. In order to make that legislation have teeth, possessing a firearm that you don't have registered with the proper authorities, that mere possession would have to become a crime. As an example, I have a collection of guns properly registered. I rent a storage unit and I store those guns in the storage unit or in a cabin in the woods or wherever. And maybe I'm a cranky old man and I don't tell my family much about it. And I die. And the guns are listed as lost in the registry because no one knows where they are. And then a grandchild comes along and is wandering in the hunting, in the hunting cabin or whatever, and discovers this collection of guns and takes those guns home and goes, oh, look, it's this cool collection from Grandpa. You are now in possession of unregistered firearms and you're now a criminal. Through no fault of your own, you are now a criminal. That is just one of the reasons why having a national gun registry is a terrible idea. Let me give you another one. It's a great first step to tyranny. If you look in the 20th century at the institution of the rise of every authoritarian government, every single one of them had at least one step that they all took in their rise to power. Every one of them created whole classes of people that were not allowed to own firearms. They collected private firearms. They registered and controlled the distribution of firearms because government understands that private gun ownership is the most effective defense against tyranny. And I'm going to take this opportunity to get another little bit off my chest, soapbox day. When you look at the conversation around gun control and you get someone like President Biden commenting on it, and he says, rifles don't help you defend against tyranny. For that, you'd need F-16s and you'd need tanks and all this stuff. You'd need nuclear weapons because that's what we have. If you accept that at face value, then you don't know anything. Sorry. How did America, with all of its complex force, get defeated and leave Afghanistan? Are you saying that rifles in the hands of a dedicated insurgency are insufficient to fight off a much more powerful foe? The Taliban would disagree with you. Are you saying that improvised explosive devices are not a sufficient counter to heavy weapons? Al-Qaeda would disagree with you. I'm not a terrorist sympathizer. I'm pointing out that the wonderful might of the American military, if turned against its own citizens, one, you're talking about a civil war. Two, do you really believe that the people who are in the military trained to use these weapons are all going to universally side with the federal government? Or do you think maybe a chunk of them might split off and take that equipment and move to the side and move against the government? I'm not saying I want anything along these lines. I'm pointing out some of the logical fallacy that says that rifles are no use against tyranny. Third, the modern complex military industrial engine requires tremendous logistical support. Guess what rifles are really good at? And I'm speaking just really brutally and really bluntly here. Rifles are really good at picking off soft targets. If you have someone skilled in hunting who has a rifle, it's not that far of a stretch to say that that person could shoot, let's say, a tank commander before he gets in his tank, could put a bullet through a jet engine before the fighter jet takes off, that someone with a little bit of experience in farm equipment and explosives could put together a bomb that blows up a supply depot that houses the replacement electronic components for the drones that are being used by the military. In America, we protect these soft targets from foreign threats. If you are seriously considering whether or not if you're seriously considering how to defend against the tyranny of the United States government turning its will against the United States citizens, you must realize that the might of the US government relies on a multiplicity of targets that the U.S. citizens protect and provide to the government. This is nightmare fuel scenario. This is not at all anything that I want to explore in detail. All I'm trying to point out is history and logic show that rifles in the hands of a dedicated private insurgency are a tremendously effective deterrent, a thorn in the side to a tyrant. And given the number of weapons in private hands in America, a not insubstantial risk to someone who tried to seize power and institute an authoritarian government over the United States. One of the reasons the U.S. remains free is because its citizens are heavily armed. And I sincerely hope that stays the case. That's my Reddit rant for today. Good luck out there.